Tonight we will be speaking about Finland and Sweden and their bid for NATO membership. Our guest is Dr. Sumantra Maitra, a National Security Fellow at the Center for the National Interest and an Associate Fellow at the Royal Historical Society in the United Kingdom. So welcome, Sumantra. And first off, just to get us rolling, why are Finland and Sweden seeking NATO membership now after decades of neutrality in the case of Finland and centuries of neutrality in the case of Sweden?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. In foreign policy, it's always about what is unsaid than what is said. I mean, the reason, as you mentioned, Finland and Sweden were both neutral, but their neutrality were because of very different reasons. In Finland's case, it was kind of like an imposed peace. I mean, during the Second World War, they realized, Soviet Union is a major threat, and they kind of understood that they won't be able to be on any side without a further risk of a war, which they never wanted to have. And instead of going as kind of like an Austrian-style constitutional neutrality, they had this equidistance from both NATO and the USSR bloc, the Warsaw Pact bloc. But also, even during the neutrality, they were closer to the NATO when it comes to intelligence sharing and all that. In Sweden's case, the neutrality goes back even further. Sweden, people, don't seem to remember, was neutral even during the Second World War. I mean, if we talk about the most black and white great power conflict in human history, where there are clearly defined good and evil, even during that situation, Sweden was neutral. So what changed? I mean, that's a major question. The answer that one can surmise from the situation is both of these countries have realized, one, that the alliance structure that they're planning to join is not a classical alliance, which used to be defending nation states and borders, but more like, in Barry Posen's word, an institution that is determined to move eastward and promote liberal hegemony. So it's the institutionalization of peace in Europe is one of the key points in this question, in this equation. The second point, as one can gather from this, from their attempts to join NATO, yes, they are obviously they are. I mean, rhetorically, they're trying to justify that, because of the growing Russian threat. But like I mentioned, I mean, if Sweden wasn't, Sweden has the buffer states of Finland and the Baltic states in between them, so they're not going to face Russian invasion. Russia is not capable of invading and conquering the entirety of Ukraine, much less Finland and the Baltics and Sweden. So it's an example of states taking advantage of a great power's weakness, rather than a sign of the great power's strength. If Russia was indeed as powerful as the USSR, it probably would have had a veto. Sweden and Finland would have both realized that it's better to be equidistant instead of incurring the wrath of this massive, gigantic power next to our doors. But they kind of know that Russia is not going to be capable of doing that in the near future, so they're taking advantage. So nothing is monocausal. I won't go into saying that this is the reason why Sweden and Finland is joining NATO. I mean, there are multiple variables, but overall, one can say that they have understood that NATO is an alliance which is based on ideas and values and moving and is predicated on moving liberal hegemony eastward. And second, they're taking advantage of the Russian weakness after their kind of like self-inflicted damage.
Yeah. So how then should the United States look at this? Because with a lot of discourse around NATO expansion, people say like, well, they'll be very focused on whether Russia gets to decide or not who gets to be in what alliance, and whether the countries that wish to join the alliance ought to have the right to choose what alliances to be in. But of course, the members of NATO get to decide. Turkey indicated its own qualms with their membership in a what seemed to be a rather cynical power play. But what about the United States? How should we be thinking about this potential expansion from the perspective of U.S. interests?
So again, 2 points on this very good question. On one hand, in the short term, it's not going to affect the United States in any way. So Personally, as a realist, I would imagine that adding burden in a security architecture is not a prudent thing to do. You can ask a realist in the United Kingdom or United States, it doesn't really matter. They're going to answer the same question in the same way. If anyone asks you whether adding more burden to an alliance to which you're committed to defending most of the states, and in any way in the alliance you are the preponderant power, the burden is going to be on you. So in the case of the United States, because US is essentially the anchor of NATO, if NATO expands eastward, regardless of the rhetorical justification, there will be more added burden on the United States. One might not agree to that, one might not say that, but it is a fact. That is what it's going to be. That being said, in the short term, it's not going to be an issue. Finland and Sweden are not like Luxembourg in a way. So they are capable powers. They have got their own security ideas, and they've got a standard army that they can bring to NATO. But there will be two factors which will affect the US interest. If you think of the US interest in European Union, it's three things essentially. One, to ensure that no one single hegemon controls the entire European continent. The reason is very simple. If one hegemon controls the entire European continent, then they would have, number one, the amount of consolidated production capability, which would outperform the United States. And number two, they would be they could essentially possibly threaten the eastern seaboard of the United States. We don't see that kind of a hegemon coming in Europe anytime soon. I mean, if not ever. I mean, I don't think the European Union is going to be a hegemon that way. It might be a rival competitive economic power, but it's not going to be a military alliance which would threaten the United States. So US doesn't face a hegemonic threat coming from the European continent. But what would happen is the other two US interests are there. Number one, every great power, which is essentially an anchor of a big alliance, is always worried about being chain ganged into other wars. So if we keep adding smaller powers on the periphery of a continent, which is kind of at peace, but there is also a lurking, nuisance on the eastern corner of the continent, then we also risk one more thing, that the powers that we are adding have got their own interests and they've got their own revanchism, as you mentioned in a tweet a couple of days back. So if we add Finland and Sweden and there's something happens in the Finnish and Swedish corridor or in the border in the Baltic states, where Finland and Sweden gets a different kind of government, which is more evangelical, which is more opposed to Russia, and they kind of like push Russia to the corner, then we will be committed to defend those countries, regardless of whether we like it or not. A formal alliance, in Lord Canning's word, is always dangerous unless like your absolute core interests are threatened. You shouldn't, expand the formal alliance, but we have already been doing that for the last 20, 25 years. So that's one, broad problem that U.S. strategic interests might face if we add Finland and Sweden. The second problem that they're going to face is fundamentally the U.S. wants the rich Western powers to pay more for their own security. Now, if we continue to expand their frontiers eastward, and if we keep on providing security guarantee for those countries, there is no legitimate interest in rich Western powers to pay for their security. Consider the case of Germany or Belgium or Luxembourg. They are rich powers. Germany traditionally is supposed to be the hegemon of Central Europe. But there is no possible situation where Germany or France will pay their fair share when they don't face any kind of threats in the East. One of the reasons why the German army had 12 divisions in 1989 was because they constantly faced a threat of invasion from the East. Now that has gone away. So if we want the existing NATO countries to pay more for their own security, adding more countries to the east and north of NATO is not a prudent thing to do. So to answer your question, the US interest in the European Union in the short term is not going to be affected. In the long term, there is always a risk of some kind of problems in the far east corners of Europe, or the fact that US will never be able to make the Western powers pay for their own security.
Yeah, well, I mean, the revanchism, maybe the Swedes will go back to Poltava or something. But you mentioned the military power of these countries. and its relationship to deterrence. And I think that that's something a thread worth pulling on. There have been kind of a couple of arguments that I've heard, particularly from the Finnish sources, which I watch more closely, suggesting that they see themselves as basically self-sufficient for security still, and that their reason for seeking NATO membership is to create a kind of strategic clarity against the Russians, to raise the risk to the Russians of going to war, because they see the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine as a sign that the Russians are not good at assessing risk, that the Russians are more willing to accept risk and fight through a conventional deterrence plan than they had previously thought, and that therefore, to prevent war from breaking out, they want to raise that cost in a really obvious way for the Russians. And there's kind of a similar argument that you'll hear on the US side, which is that the United States would be drawn in if a war broke out there anyway, and that therefore it makes sense for us to get the benefit of strategic clarity, namely a possible greater deterrence value, if we're going to have to pay the price of a fight anyway. I mean, it's very similar to the strategic ambiguity versus strategic clarity arguments that you'll see about Taiwan nowadays. What are your thoughts there?
So I've heard of the argument that, Finland wants to kind of clarify their position vis-a-vis Russia, that, regardless of what happens, we will be part of this alliance and there will be a massive force backing up. I don't see, let me put it this way. I don't think any sensible threat analyst in either Finland or the United States think that Russians are foolish enough to invade Finland. It's an argument that is used to justify further NATO enlargement in the European continent. But we have to remember, at the time of speaking, what have we seen from the Russian invasion of Ukraine? One, that the Russians are not really good in multi-domain operations. It's primitive the way their air force and their navy and their army is coordinating campaigns together. It's not functional. It's no way at par to any of the Western powers. I mean, yes, US and UK and NATO suffered a lot in counterinsurgency campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan, but peer-to-peer wars is a different question. The Iraqi army was no match for the NATO alliance because, we were really good with multi-domain operations. Russians are not really that good. Second, at the time of speaking, the Russians couldn't capture Kiev. Like, one of their objectives, they're trying to kind of like show that there was not their primary objective. Their primary objective was to just cut off the eastern parts of Ukraine. First of all, that's a lie. Secondly, even if we agree that was not the primary objective, they are not being able to pacify the eastern parts of Ukraine either. They're facing their own counterinsurgency operations. They're facing their own IEDs and all that kind of stuff. Third, the Russian logistics is absolutely awful. I mean, it's no way comparable to the Soviet Union, which had the bulk in any kind of operational process. Which, if you remember studying the Soviet Union's military journals from the 90s, or even from the 80s, you would see that they had this column formations and bulk movements, and the tank battalions coming forward, and then this massive bulk movement of logistics supply lines behind. Those are all gone. The Russian army, they're not capable of doing that kind of operations anymore. So I don't think the Finnish, strategists are foolish. So obviously they have studied the Russian operations in Ukraine, and just as we have studied the Russian operations in Ukraine, I don't think anyone believes technically that Russians their ability to absorb damage and mitigate the threats and then still go for an invasion is that important. I think it's used as a justification for NATO enlargement process. I don't buy into that. What your second question was? What was your second question? Russian.
Whether the United States should join for the should bring Finland in particular into the alliance, because to create strategic clarity,
right,
because we get drawn in anyway. That's
so
the deal.
So from Finland's perspective, it makes sense to have, to sign the dotted papers and say like, hey, we are part of this alliance, and if something happens, US will come. But number one, the Finnish reserve forces are 900,000 strong. Finland is the only country in the European continent which never really abolished its own conscription, for example. So what could we possibly help Finland with in case of an attack other than nuclear deterrence that we couldn't if Finland was outside NATO? I'll take a different part of that. So imagine a situation where Finland is not a NATO member and Finland faces an invasion from Russia. Very unlikely, but let's give you, I'll give you the benefit of the doubt. I'll take the agreement that Finland faces an invasion from Russia. What could we possibly do to help Finland that we cannot do if they're not part of the NATO alliance? We would still supply them with weapons. We are doing that in Ukraine. We would still help them with intelligence and and data and targeting. I mean, we are helping the Ukrainians with targeting. That's pretty much being a co-belligerent according to rules of law, right? I mean, we would obviously do that with Finland because we share massive intelligence in the Arctic with the Finnish strategic circles. The only thing that we are willing to do on behalf of Finland, if it's part of the NATO alliance, is to go to a nuclear war with Russia. Now, that might be intelligent from the Finnish perspective. I don't think that's very intelligent from our perspective. I mean, we could have helped Finland even without, if Finland was not part of NATO, without taking the risk of going to a nuclear war in case Russia, invades Finland. So, yeah, to go back to the answer, I don't really buy that, they see Russian threat, conventional deterrence and risk calculus have changed.
So another perspective that I've heard is centers on the fact that they already have this very large military reserve, a powerful artillery force, seen as a pretty capable military. One view then is, okay, bring them in and they'll be a net security contributor across NATO, that they might add to some of these other deterrence initiatives, be able to position forces elsewhere. And that this could enable the United States to draw down in Europe because there would be more forces in Europe. The second argument is that they will serve as an example to other countries in NATO that have been laggards on military procurement, on just overall military effectiveness and sizing, and that therefore the other states will step up and again, that this would enable the United States to reduce its commitment to Europe.
Yeah, I mean, I recently read that foreign policy piece arguing pretty much the same, like, getting Finland and Sweden part of the NATO alliance would enable the United States to essentially draw down from Europe and focus on Asia and retrench. I mean, I think it fundamentally misunderstands, states' behavior during in an alliance structure. I mean, historically, I'll throw the question back at anyone who's arguing, this posture is like, have you ever seen historically that is happening? Think of the first three phases of NATO expansion. Did we think that? Do we think that US, drew down from the European Union? No. We added Hungary and Poland and Romania in the first phase, which was essentially an expansion of German frontier to the east. Did that mean? What happened after that immediately? Germany and France and UK, the major three powers who are the primary guarantors of European security, they cut down their own forces. And so the idea, and US had to be there. US still stayed. No one changed. No one came back from the Europe. Donald Trump, when he came to power, he said that we need to make the Germans pay, and then he took some forces from Germany. So his instinct was right, but then what he did wrong was he immediately put those forces back in Poland. From the US perspective, I just don't think that's happening. I don't think there's going to be any retrenchment. We are already putting more forces back in the European Union. So that's not happening. The second thing is, Sweden is not a part of NATO, and it's already demanding permanent U.S. naval presence in the Baltic Sea. I mean, if anything is to go by, I think there is a contradiction in the Finnish argument and the Swedish argument. On one hand, they say we are really strong and we are going to bring all our capabilities in defending NATO. If you're that strong, then why do you need NATO? And then they're saying, no, we are actually weak. We need NATO to come and help ourselves. And by that, they mean we need the US forces and US security umbrella. So I think there's a logical contradiction in those arguments. And I personally, if history is of any guide, I don't think that's going to happen. It's a hopeless situation. From listening to the US senators, and there's this realism and restraint community on the conservative side, you would have imagined that they kind of understand the public sentiment about spending more money in Ukraine, about getting more people, getting more states in the NATO. But if you see the way the process is moving in Pentagon, in the Congress, it's kind of disappointing. They're doing exactly the same flaw. They're committing the same flaws that they have committed for the last 20 years. And I don't think anything is going to change that way.
So one of the specific points I've seen raised about this prospective NATO membership is that Russia seems to be acquiescing to it. They've Putin, when their membership bid was announced, gave a rather bland statement about hey, we'll see where this goes. We're not really all that worried about it. And then they have also pulled some of their forces away from the frontier in Finland. And in fact, at least one of those units was put into really heavy fighting and lost a lot of people. And it was like a specialized Arctic warfare unit that would probably be pretty important in the event of a conflict with Finland. So the reason this is said to be relevant is if this is the case, that Russia is acting like this, is it really true that they are threatened by NATO expansion? Or are they just using the NATO expansion argument as a cover for just imperial ambitions that they had anyway?
So there are two ways of looking at this question. One is related to something that I mentioned in answer to your first question. The reason Finland and Sweden is trying to join NATO is essentially a testament to the fact that Russians are weak. It's a sign of Russian weakness compared to their strength that we see that this NATO expansion is going on, because we know Russians are incapable of doing anything now. They're number one. They're bogged down in Ukraine. They can't conquer 1/3 of a country, which is pretty much like being constantly fed by NATO. NATO is essentially fighting a proxy war with Russia. So Russians are in war with NATO, just not without NATO armies pouring into Ukraine. Supply chains are all there. Money, unlimited amount of money, weapons, training, and even targeting coordinates. So that's one thing. The second, there is a research paper that I did in 2020, which is partly taken from my PhD thesis, where I demonstrated the Russian threat perception based on balance of threat theory of Stephen Walt. So if you remember, balance of threat theory, argues that there are 4 variables which determines the threat perception of a great power. 1, aggregate power. 2, geographic proximity. 3, offensive power, and 4, offensive intention. So, and I took that theory and I focused that on 3 phases of NATO expansion and the Russian reaction to each of those phases. And I came out with this conclusion that 1, Russians don't really oppose NATO expansion per se, like in theory. What they oppose are very specific to the variables to areas where their strategic interests are threatened. So, for example, if NATO expands and adds Montenegro, the Russians don't really care. They'll huff a lot about, NATO is expanding and, it's coming closer to our borders, but they're not going to say anything. But the moment it turns to Ukraine or Georgia, where Russians had defensible interests, that's a different matter altogether. So, for example, Russian military supply lines and repairs used to happen in eastern parts of Ukraine, some of the places where the industrial complex of Ukraine is. So they are going to defend that. Russian pipelines go through Georgia, and through Abkhazia and all those places. They're going to defend that. So anywhere where there is strategic interests, where they feel strategic interests are threatened, they lash out. In the other, regions where exactly the same thing happens, they don't, because they don't feel their strategic interests will be threatened. So to answer your question, as I mentioned, in the short term, I don't think anything is going to happen. And given how stupid this war was from Russian perspective, I mean, they are obviously they understand more than anyone. No matter what they try and they put a bold face in the media, but they understand what a mistake it was to invade Ukraine. I mean, they could have gotten a proper deal just by keeping their forces in the border, but they pulled the trigger. And the moment you pull the trigger, you get punched in the face. So in a way, I think the Russians are weak now. And I think one of the reasons that the Finland and Sweden is expanding is they understand exactly how weak Russians are. So yes, they feel threatened by NATO expansion, but I don't think that's the proper question. The proper question is in which parts of NATO their strategic interests are being threatened.
Yeah, so maybe to push you on that a little bit, Finland is right by St. Petersburg, and the access to St. Petersburg, if Finland joins, the sea access to St. Petersburg will go between through the Gulf of Finland, which is a pretty narrow channel, and they'll be sailing the Baltic fleet between two NATO territories, and I think it's maybe 30 miles wide. Yeah. And they in the past, during the Winter War and that era, displayed a great interest in that channel. Demanded territory from the Finns for basing. We're very concerned about the situation on the other side in Estonia as well. So, shouldn't activity in that area be extremely concerning, given that how important St. Petersburg is to Russia?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I'm not disagreeing to the idea that the Russian naval corridors in the far north are being threatened in a way from their perception with Finland and Sweden joining. I mean, they understand why Finland and Sweden is joining NATO, and they understand that their Arctic circles are going to be threatened, technically threatened in a way. I mean, I think they understand as well that NATO has no military designs on Russia. I don't think Finnish armies are going to march to St. Petersburg, and nor do they. But yes, strategically, it's a bad question for Russia, and they completely understand that Finland joining NATO would threaten their northern lines. That being said, two things. One, Russia is not really fighting a war in Ukraine. They are fighting a war. What they try and say is they're doing a special military operation in Ukraine. The reason this is important is because if Russians are in a full throttle war with NATO, they would be able to use the same advantages that Ukraine is now gaining from. So they would have martial law, they would have conscription, they would immediately increase their manpower tenfold, because Russia is a big country, it's got 143 million people. So Russians can raise their army. So the idea that Russians are moving military from the Finnish border shouldn't give us the impression that the Russians don't feel threatened by Finland. They still do feel threatened by Finland. They still do feel threatened by expansion of NATO. They are just prioritizing, what they could do now, given that they are in a stupid operation of their own.
Yeah, and folks, feel free to drop questions in the Q&A, by the way. But another question I have that kind of sticks to this this theme, looking at the Baltic situation from the U.S. and NATO side of the coin, there's a view that adding Sweden and Finland would significantly increase the security of the Baltic states, which already are in NATO, because of that Finnish position on the north end, of the Gulf of Finland, and then because of Sweden's Gotland Island off the coast of the Baltics, that the Russians would be very hard pressed to conduct any kind of operation in the Baltics with support from the sea, given such a strong NATO position. What do you think about that? That this might improve Baltic security?
So to answer that question, I'd simply say that makes sense if you think that the Russians are intending Russians intend to invade or do operations in the Baltics. And that is $1 million question. If whether the Russians intend to do any kind of operation in the Baltics, I personally don't think so. I mean, there is no evidence that the Russian threat perception or strategic, community is determined to have. Ukraine is a different thing altogether for Russia. We have to understand that Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, these are very different equations for Russia than compared to the Baltic states. I mean, even during the Cold War, the Baltic states were always considered very different from the core Slavic countries, which Russian Empire was based on. So yes, the Baltics. I mean, there was a Randcorp research paper that came out, I think it was in 2016 or 2017, that stated that if Russia does invade, they would be in Riga in 6 days or something. Now, there were lots of variables. Again, one that predicates Russian invasion to be a full throttle invasion where Russia is fully armed with, with a martial law and conscription, and, Russian armies marching en masse. I don't think that kind of operation is happening in Ukraine. I don't think Russians are capable of doing that kind of operation. I mean, it's a theoretical question. If someone asks me, are you willing to bet on it? I would probably say no. But in all probability, I don't think the Russians are intending to invade Baltics. So yes, it does increase Baltic states' defense calculus to have Finland in the north. But on the other hand, it would have always been the same. I don't think we are ever going to find out whether the Baltic states actually ever faced a genuine Russian land invasion threat.
Yeah, well, speaking of that, this is a little bit of a pivot, but there was this recent Lithuania Kaliningrad situation where they started talking about how they were going to apply EU sanctions to prevent a lot of Russian goods from going from core Russia out to the exclave of Kaliningrad. What did you make of that? What were the Lithuanians kind of said, well, we looked into it and realized this was what the EU regulation said, so our hands were tied and we had to do it.
Yeah, I think there is a standard of argument which kind of mentions that how Lithuania and Estonia and some of the Baltic states are, especially Estonia and Lithuania, not that much Latvia, but even then that they are more evangelical compared to the rest of the European NATO members.
Evangelical meaning
evangelical meaning they are more determined about pushing back Russia because of their personal experience historically, which is, in a way, it's justified. They were under brutal Soviet, occupation. So the way they see Russia is very different than way, we see Russia in a way. But that being said, I think this specific instance, there was kind of a miscommunication. I think the Lithuanians, you have to remember that ever since the Ukrainian war started, the two countries which constantly pushed for more, punishing measures on Russia were Estonia and Lithuania. They were the first ones to argue for no-fly zone, and that was taken up by some of our fellow scholars like Evelyn Farkas in the US. They are the ones who are still arguing that we have to have this naval escort to get grains out of Ukraine, even when there is back-channel diplomacy going on between Turkey, their fellow NATO member, by the way, and Russia about moving Ukraine and Ukrainian grains out. But the question is, because these countries are in such a precarious geographical situation and position, and because these are NATO members and because of this war hysteria, we don't really question them that number one, the fact that Estonia and Lithuania are pushing to be more punishing towards Russia, what would actually happen when push comes to shove? If tomorrow, because in a hypothetical situation, if tomorrow there is something, the Lithuanians think of like doing a blockade of Russian Navy somewhere, are they capable of doing that? No. Then what would happen? They are going to ask us to go and defend them when fires are actually drawn. If a Russian warship fires in anger at an escort ship, what happens? It drags NATO to war. No-fly zone. How would that operationally happen? So some of these things, some of these countries, even when they say a lot of things, they do a lot of things, but then they realize that they are not. It's not a prudent thing to do. The Kaliningrad situation was something similar. I think Germany was the one who kind of like backed off. And then everyone was like, yeah, we probably shouldn't do that. I have my personal opinions on how the risk of chain ganging from really small and extremely ideological allies are dangerous. In fact, far more dangerous when it comes to a great power war than a rival great power. But I think suffice to say that it is the risk for the United States.
Yeah, to stick with that chain ganging theme, since we've been talking about Finland and Sweden going into NATO, and the paper that we're kind of discussing here that I've neglected to mention, which was for the Center for Renewing America, I will send it around to everybody who's in attendance. You did say in passing, that NATO membership does serve Finnish and Swedish interests. And I'm curious what you would make of the reverse chain ganging argument, which is they now are at risk of getting entangled in NATO's conflicts. If you're for instance, a lot of European countries, you wouldn't think they would have gotten involved in Afghanistan and had been sending troops to Afghanistan had it not been for their NATO membership, and that perhaps they might now the Finnish and Swedish might be opening themselves up to a new path to war. What do you make of that argument about their interests?
Yeah, chain ganging as a theme works more in favor of the countries which in power distribution, which are inferior to the countries which are superior. So by that, I mean, Finland and Sweden have obviously made this threat calculation, right? I mean, they were independent states with a declared neutrality, or in Finland's case, undeclared neutrality, but neutrality nevertheless. And they have made this calculation that, yes, they do have, being a part of an alliance means that they have to be a part of collective defense, but they have also done that calculation, but that instance of collective defense might not arise. I mean, what could happen is, as you mentioned, in situations like counterinsurgency operations in Somalia or Afghanistan or Iraq. But even then, how many soldiers did Luxembourg send to Afghanistan and Iraq? They were part of NATO alliance. They went even or Germany for that matter. I think there was, I can't remember which country it was, whether it was Luxembourg or some other Western European country, which sent like 8 soldiers in total. That to like in the logistics supply chain. So I think if you ask the Finnish and Swedish, I'm not privy to their process tracing, to the kind of talks that goes on inside the Finnish military circles, but one can assume that they have made that calculation that from their perspective, the risk of chain ganging is less than the collective security. The risk of chain ganging is more on in the case of Germany and France, and obviously the United States. Part of the reason, Germany and France are big powers. They have to take the disproportionate amount of burden if a war breaks out. And obviously the United States. I mean, the US, there is literally no hegemonic threat in the European continent that threatens the United States' strategic interest. There is no one who is willing to sink a US ship in the Atlantic or the English Channel or the Mediterranean or the Baltic. It's not going to happen. So the only way the chain gang risk works in their favor and not ours is because we would be drawn to a war to defend smaller alliances and smaller powers. So, if I have to answer that question, I think they made the calculation and they've realized that, it's not really that of an issue.
So you mentioned earlier that there's a lot of intelligence cooperation that happens between these countries and the West, and I've also heard that intelligence cooperation cited as a reason to integrate them into the alliance. That we would get access to some really good stuff on the Russians, especially because, you look at northern Finland, it's right up near the Kola Peninsula and, kind of the main Russian naval base at Severomorsk.
I mean, I hear these kind of arguments and I ask for the specifics, and no one gives me the specifics to what exactly are we missing now that we will be getting then, with Finland part of the NATO alliance.
It's secret.
Yeah, that's the thing. We have strong bilateral relationships with both of these countries. Even though Sweden and Finland were neutral nominally, they were pretty close to the Western alliance, even during the Cold War, and some of the things that we share with our closest partners in the Five Eyes, we are not going to give them anyway. I don't think the US intelligence, which shares intelligence with the basic core Anglosphere countries like Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand, those are not the things that Finland and Sweden will get. And the things that we get from them, keeping an eye on Russian, flight patterns, keeping an eye on the Russian hypersonic tests in the Arctic, we already get them anyway. So if we have to do a cost-benefit calculus here in this situation, on one hand, these are the things that we are getting. We are not getting anything extra. On the other hand, these are the things which we don't have to give now, which we might have to give in the future if they're part of the alliance. I think this hand is heavier. To make that calculation in a real-time basis, the things that we are getting from Finland and Sweden, their armies, which are going to stay anyway. That's not. The Finnish conscription, it doesn't come to play unless Finland is invaded. Finland is not going to be invaded by Russia. We are working under the assumption that Russians are foolish to be bogged down in Ukraine. They don't have the capability of going to Finland and the Baltic states anyway. So the entire idea that Finland brings 1,000 soldiers in NATO is flawed because those are conscription soldiers and they don't come into play unless there is an invasion or war. So we are not getting anything that we are not getting now anyway. In fact, what we have to do is we have to extend our nuclear guarantee to a country which might or might not have small, flare-ups in their borders, and it would have been prudent to avoid.
So one other, you have a forthcoming essay for Law and Liberty arguing that NATO on this issue should adopt what you call the Lansdowne Doctrine. So tell us what you're talking about here.
So Lord Lansdowne is an interesting character. Well, was an interesting character, an extraordinary character. He was, one of the last aristocrats who worked for both Liberal and Tory governments in the UK and the British Empire before the First World War. And he was the Viceroy of Canada. He was the Governor General of Canada. He was the Viceroy of India. So he was extremely polite and courteous, was incapable of any kind of dishonesty, and it was the true noblesse oblige kind of old school British imperial guy. But he was also conservative in the sense Metternich and Castlereagh and Talleyrand would have been called a conservative, as to he wanted to preserve the established order that he understood was threatened by a great power war, and he had the foresight of understanding that if we do a total war with a great power where the other power is destroyed, that would embroil the entire region into sort of a kind of turmoil, like a Hobbesian turmoil through which is going to be like revolutionary, and that would lead to the destruction of not just the other power but us as well. So it's a philosophical argument which he made. in 1917, where he wrote an infamous or famous, depending on which side of the political spectrum you are, letter to the Times, the original, the London Times, saying that, look, we are in this war with Germany, but we shouldn't be under the impression, we should take, notes from how our forefathers dealt after the fall of Napoleonic France. They came together for a concert. They didn't destroy the rival powers and their internal order because they understood that revolution, egalitarianism are far more dangerous because it brings kind of like idealistic impulses. That would then, intertwine us with, in a revolutionary fire. So what his idea was, one, he said that we shouldn't go to a total war with a great power rival. We should kind of come to a negotiated settlement. Even though we are capable of winning the war, it would overall destroy the British Empire as we know, which was true, by the way, in hindsight. He argued for a concert of great powers in Europe and said that, the empires and all the great powers which are already in Europe should stay together, come together and build a concert and kind of understand that, it's not in our interest to go to total war. Again, in hindsight, 4 out of 5 massive empires with the Russians, the Ottomans, Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany collapsed after the First World War. So his basic idea was to sort of create an equilibrium in a way Metternich or Castlereagh would have created, and not, expand or not have, this kind of idea that we should humiliate our great power rivals. Because his idea was that once the social fabric of the region we live is destroyed because of war, it's very difficult to maintain order, even on the victorious side. And I think he was right. So I think for what I tried to gather in that essay, and it's forthcoming in August for anyone interested, is at some point of time, negotiated settlements are probably the lesser of two evils because no one controls what happens when an order is destroyed.
Yeah, it brings to mind there was a very similar document produced in Russia ahead of World War I by Count Durnovo, who basically said, "Hey, if we get in this big war with Germany, we're not going to be able to win, and there's going to be a big revolution." And they found it in Nicholas's papers during that revolution. And it's not clear if he ever read it. He apparently didn't act on it. And so another question here, just to pivot over to the professional dimension. You've had an interesting career. You're early in your career, but I'm curious about one piece of advice you'd give to someone who wants to follow in your footsteps professionally.
So I was a journalist before I turned to academia and then policy. My first master's was in journalism in Moscow. My second one was in an MPhil in international relations, and I continued doing that with economics. And then I did my PhD. The one thing which I would suggest to people is to read old history books, and there are two reasons for it. One, the discipline of history itself has sort of changed. In a way, history is written, history is studied. On one hand, there are lots of focus on very unit level variables, focusing on weaving patterns in some countries, and that, it gets calculated or counted as history. Some people write about how letters were written in the First World War trenches, and that counts as First World War history. So, it's not holistic, it's not broad. So modern history, even though there are really good works coming out in some places, is not a discipline that would encourage a lot of young scholars. And unless you understand history in the holistic term, I don't think you would succeed in either academia or policy or diplomacy or anything that you do. I mean, you would still have a career in international relations, but I don't think if you really want to have study diplomacy and international relations in the way it's studied, I would suggest people to read history, which are old school. So, for example, recently I was writing an essay on reactionary vanguardism in country, a small country in a core Central Europe, is kind of like reverting to an authoritarian, reactionary, vanguardist party, but essentially relying on Leninist ideas of vanguard party and putting their people in their positions of power. And I was doing that. And I was reading the history of the Habsburg monarchy by A.J.P. Taylor. And those are not the kind of history that you read anymore. It's genuine historical. It's an overarching idea of a country, of a region that happened, and the history and the things that happened in that country, and the diplomatic history and the interpersonal history between the diplomats of those periods that used to happen. So imagine Kissinger's book on Metternich. That was a PhD thesis. I don't think Kissinger would pass if he publishes that book as a PhD thesis, and he won't pass a PhD committee anymore, because there were not many citations or referencing, but it was probably one of the best history of the concept of Europe that you would find. It was written in 1954. So I would suggest people to read old history books, which gives you a broad idea of a region that you're interested in. I think that helped me personally. That might help others too.
Yeah, well, I have to say, one of my favorite books about John Quincy Adams, being the eponym of the society, is Samuel Flagg Bemis's book on him from probably the 1950s as well. It's definitely pre-1970, I believe, by a significant margin. Which is that it? Oh my goodness, some of the books that I have behind me, and I was reading this book for a research, and it's a book by Teddy Roosevelt on the war on 1812. And I would like to ask people, how many modern presidential, people who are, standing for president or prime minister, would anyone be capable of writing a diplomatic and military history of your war that happened just 20 years, 25 years back? I think this is what I mean by old history. People used to study events and then analyze in a holistic way. I think they don't do it anymore. So that's important to me. Yeah, it's an important discipline. The past is prologue in foreign affairs. So that wraps up our event. I didn't see any fresh questions from the audience. So I think we'll go ahead and conclude here. Thank you, Dr. Mitra, for taking the time to speak with us. Thank you to all of you for attending. This has been another digital discussion with the John Quincy Adams Society. Good night.